Ouch! Accidents happen. Do you have the core skills that you need to take action and save lives when seconds count? Today, first responder Nick Miller talks about 7 core first aid skills that can make all the difference. Hey, Provident Preppers, I'm Jonathan.
And I'm Kylene, and today we are thrilled to have Nick Miller, who is an emergency response expert, and he's going to talk to us about first aid skills. Those are one of the most important things that you can know, and it can totally save lives. So Nick, why don't you take a minute and introduce yourself to our audience? Many of them probably already know you, but let's introduce you again.
Hello, I'm Nick. I'm a longtime paramedic and paramedic instructor. I teach everything from first aid all the way up to paramedic and do various things in emergency management. Right now, my biggest thing is Boy Scouts, so for my kid, and teaching, of course, EMT and paramedic classes. So here's our quick and dirty presentation on first aid. I know it's kind of a Captain Obvious moment, but we want to make sure we understand that a core skill are the critical things you must need to provide competent first aid. Everything builds on these skills. Even in the first day of EMT class, we start teaching these skills. And the only difference between the first aid person and the paramedic is how much we spend on each step and the amount of stuff we do. But it still builds here. So if you're new to first aid or new to wanting to do this sort of stuff or have an interest, I would master these skills first. The first core skill is patient assessment. All care starts with the patient assessment. The reason we have to know the patient assessment first is it lets us determine what's wrong with them. So when we look at emergencies, and this is the same for first aid to paramedic, we either have a true emergency or we have a boo-boo, or we have the military affectionately refers to as sick calls. I'm sick. As someone who's doing first aid, our immediate thing with the patient assessment is to basically do a triage of the patient in our head and determine, do we have a true emergency, or do we have a boo-boo, or do we have someone sick? Do we need to call 911? Do we need to do these things? When we go through this, I'm going to let you know that the first aid assessment focuses primarily on life threats. It is basic. We're not expecting you to do 100 things like at the paramedic level. And even then, there's not much from the EMT to the paramedic level. Most of the time, this assessment is going to be easy and pretty obvious. The kid's going to come over and go, I cut my finger. That's pretty straightforward. What's not straightforward is when you have someone unresponsive on the ground. They may be seizing. They may be vomit coming out. They may be not breathing or not have a pulse. And that's when the adrenaline starts kicking in. And that's when it can start to be overwhelming. So again, I've said this in other videos we've done, but get training. And when in doubt, call 911. That's my first advice to you, because we're professionally trained to do that. We do that every day. It's like baking cookies for you, Colleen, going to an emergency. We've just done it so much. It's what we do. We don't expect you as lay people to know what's an emergency or not all the time. I would rather you wake me up out of bed 6 times than to not wake me up and end up with someone dying. So when in doubt, call us. We get paid to show up. You pay your tax dollars. We're there. And I tell my students, if you can't handle that, don't come into the profession, because you're there as a public servant. When in doubt, call 911. That makes your life simple. And then what your guys to do at first aid is we're going to assess the patient to see if we have to do anything to make sure this patient stays alive until EMS arrives. There's things that must happen before I get there, and the clock's ticking on some of these things. First thing we want to go through is scene safety. If the scene is not safe, you need to leave it. You need to walk away and again call 911. You cannot be working in a fire to help someone who's got smoke inhalation, because you're going to get smoke inhalation too and die with them. You cannot become part of the problem, because now I have to do more work. I have 2 patients instead of 1 patient. And the scene safety, the first thing, is it safe? And then the next thing we want to look at is how many patients are there. And then this is where we put on our gloves and everything else good. And then we need to ask this question, do I need EMS? So if the scene is unsafe, of course, call 911. Get out of it. We're trained to deal with that. The next thing we want to look at is the patient conscious? And this is not very hard. From day one, we teach this AVPU scale. Now, at first aid, you don't have to remember this per se, but it's very helpful to know how unconscious someone is. So AVPU just stands for alert. This is like you and me talking today. We're alert. We're responding to each other. Verbal is kind of like when they're sleepy. They don't really respond. You have to really talk to them. Hey, John, what? That's verbal. Painful is when you have to give them a good sternal rub to wake them up. They need some sort of pain to wake up. And then there's people when they're out, they are out. They do not respond to anything. I'm going to make it real simple for first aid. If they're not alert, call 911. It really is that simple because there's something wrong that's impeding blood flow to the brain that's causing them not to be alert. So unless they have dementia and normally only know their name, you need to be calling 911 if they're not alert. Next is major bleeding. In the old days, bleeding was down in C, circulation. Now it's moved up. It's moved up to the top because we've learned through many years of trauma medicine and the war on terror that it is far easier to keep blood in the body than it is to replace it. You must do this in the first 3 minutes of a major bleed. So when we say what's a major bleed, some people use the word hemorrhage, but we're in America, so I like bleed. We're looking for what we call arterial bleeding. If it's spurting, if it's pouring, if it's a loss of blood, that's basically all we're looking for, major bleed. And then you have to remember to look everywhere because heavy jeans or coats can hide blood under clothes. So we teach our students to do what we call a blood sweep. And we look for blood everywhere on folks. So at the first aid point, we just need to look for blood. Next thing we want to do is look for it at the airway. We want to determine if the airway is open and can the patient keep it open. That's known as self-maintaining. So this is why a lot of your IFACs and everything now carry nasal airways. But the first aid level, we don't get that advanced into it. We just want to know, is it open? Respiration and ventilation. Is the patient breathing? Is the patient breathing adequately? By that I mean, not only is not breathing bad, but if you breathe too slow or too fast, it's basically the same as not breathing at all because that air never actually makes it to the lungs to have gas exchange. And then also we want to look at, are they in distress, like asthma, or they're having an allergic reaction, a bad anaphylaxis? Are they having difficulty breathing? Just how is the breathing? Are they breathing? And are they breathing adequately? Or are they having trouble breathing? We just want to know. And again, when in doubt, call 911. We're good at figuring that out. Circulation. We just want to know at the first aid level, do you have a pulse? Because if you don't have a pulse, we have to do something about that right away. If you have a pulse, then we can hold on until 911 arrives. New thing that's been added in the last couple of years because of the war on terror and all the peer-reviewed studies is now we care about thermal regulation. So we had hypothermia, hyperthermia. If the patient's too hot or too cold, we have a problem because patients who are losing a lot of blood tend to become hypothermic. So we're looking at this. This is where we're going to check the skin, color, and temperature. Is something wrong with it? Are we in a place that's too hot or too cold? If you're too hot, they're probably too hot. If they're too cold, they're probably too cold. But even in warm August, if they're bleeding out, they're going to be hypothermic. They're not going to be able to thermoregulate, and they're going to have problems down the line with clotting and all sorts of other problems. So finally, at the end, once we make sure all the life threats have been addressed, the things that are going to kill them in a couple of minutes, the first 2 to 3 minutes, then we can do what we call examine for disability. We're going to make a decision. They're either going to be what we call an EMS, stable or unstable. So if they're what we call unstable, meaning they're semi-conscious or unresponsive, we're going to scan that whole body and make sure we didn't miss any bleeds somewhere and see what other major injuries that person has. If they're alert, that probably means they're stable. So we can focus on, I cut my finger. In the real world, we kind of do all that assessment all the way because we know if a guy's walking up to us, we know he's alert because he recognizes I'm there. I can talk to him. He's conscious, obviously, because he's walking. He has an airway because he's walking and talking. He doesn't look like he's breathing hard, and he didn't put on a coat, so we're probably okay. So now I can focus on his finger. Or someone who's unresponsive, I don't know if I got to determine, is he conscious or is he just taking a nap? Sounds silly, but I found people and gone to 911 calls where random homeless people or other people just decide to take a nap in someone's front yard. Is the airway open? We had a terrible case last year at Boy Scouts where a 11-year-old died choking and no one caught it until they found him unresponsive. Are they breathing? Do they have a pulse? I've worked cardiac arrests at a Boy Scout camp, so it happens. Are they too hot or too cold? Especially if you're out camping or hiking. A lot of times when we use first aid, we're out in the woods, or we're out at the park, or we're out somewhere, we're not inside our nice house. Once we do all that, then we can look at, okay, you got stung by a bee, okay, I'm sick, all that other stuff. Pretty much at first aid, again, it's simple. If they're unconscious, make sure you didn't miss something. If they're conscious, now we can say, what's going on today?
This patient assessment, how long are we talking about? This is something that happens in what, 20 or 30 seconds?
I tell my students 90 seconds. That's treating everything.
Okay.
So basically, it's real common sense. Let common sense prevail. I just put this on this slide. Like if the guy's talking to you, nothing's wrong, and he stubbed his toe, let's not make a mountain out of a molehill, right? But if the guy is unresponsive, or even he's talking, even he goes, okay, you know he's not okay. Call 911. Again, keep this real simple at your stage. This is why we tell people, first aid is a 1 to 2 day class. So we don't expect to do this in our little 30 minutes here today. But again, when in doubt, call 911. Just focus on the obvious things, and we'll kind of go through those with those other skills, what to do about it. First, we have to recognize there's a problem. It can be overwhelming to people who've never done this before. Again, when in doubt, let common sense prevail. When in doubt, call 911. Can't make it simpler than that. Hang in there, we're coming. Skill number 2, control bleeding. Critical must-know skill. You must control it in the first 3 minutes. So in the very beginning, we talked about bleeding is now moved to the top. If you see a big bleed, stop it, plug it. The first thing we want to do is we want to grab it, direct pressure. I had a guy walk in the ER once with the radial artery completely severed, just holding his wrist. And the triage nurse was getting a little upset because she had nothing to bandage it with. And I literally just grabbed it with my own gloved hand and walked him to the linen closet and used a towel and tied it. I don't know how he was still standing. That was amazing. The next step we want to do for any wound is a pressure bandage. And there are a lot of options. I wrote some of them down here. Simple as a 5 by 9 inch bandage and a cravat, which is a triangle bandage. You can get those at Walmart cheap for a couple bucks. In fact, almost all my arterial bleeds, I bandage this way because there weren't these fancy IFAC bandages back when I was on the ambulance. And most ambulances still don't carry them. If you got hemostatic gauze, great, that helps too. But pressure bandage is the first thing. I know a lot of people are starting to say tourniquet, tourniquet, tourniquet. But pressure bandage is still the number one treatment done at National Registry. I just sent my kids to the EMT national test, and the first thing they do is a pressure bandage. Pressure bandage also has the advantage of I'm not cutting off circulation to the body. So simple pressure bandage. Not 5 by 9 and a cravat is in every single first aid kit. Tourniquets aren't always in every kit. Now, if that doesn't work, then we can go to, depending on where the bleed is. So if it is the extremity, then we'll go to the tourniquet. You can use a commercial tourniquet, and there's only 2 that are recommended by TCCC or by me, and everyone pretty much carries the Cat 7. Soft T is just a Cat 7 on steroids, but every place I've ever worked in the country has always carried a Cat 7. So that's a good one. An improvised tourniquet, we talked about that in the first aid, how we can make one. Put them on high and tight, and then here's the key thing, write the time on their forehead. I've heard people go, don't use a black tourniquet because the nurse won't see it in the ER. No, they'll see it. And I know they'll see it because when you have the tourniquet time and military time on their forehead, they'll know there's one. Can't miss it. So we teach our guys to write it on the forehead. I carry a permanent marker in my bag just for that. You can put it on tape first if you want to be nice, but usually just make sure you put it on there because once you put the tourniquet on, clock's ticking. There have been cases where people have had tourniquets left on too long and lost their extremities. So just remember that. If that doesn't work, you also have the option of wound packing. There's now a course for lay people called Stop the Bleed, where you can practice wound packing. Basically take rolled gauze and stuff the wound and keep pressure on it till it stops. Unfortunately, now we have to teach that with all the terrorism things going on and the mass shootings. We're now dealing with bigger holes than we used to 20 years ago. Wound packing is great if it's in the armpits or the groin. Tourniquets only work on the extremities. That's another reason why you want to do pressure bandages first. If you get injured in the head or you get injured in the chest, you can't tourniquet that. You can't tourniquet a groin area or an armpit. And then everywhere else, you're going to just keep putting hemostatic gauze on it and hold it down till EMS gets there. If you bleed through a bandage, don't take it off. Just put a new one on top of it because we're starting to get clots. We don't want to rip off those clots. Does that make sense? I had a guy once that was cut across his entire chest. It was about a 1/4 inch wide and literally no normal bands fit that. I literally put rolls of gauze in the hole and ace wrapped it. But by the time he got to the ER and the ER docs were ready to look at it, it actually formed clots. And they had to pry that off. So what you don't want to do is lose that clotting stuff by taking it off to put a newer bandage on it. Put it on top. Lay it right on top. And hold manual pressure. If it's still bleeding through the manage, put pressure on it. I cannot emphasize enough how that is a core skill. Manual pressure in controlling the bleeding. Number 3, core skills. We must maintain a patent airway. How are we going to do that? We first decide, is it open? If it's not open, we're going to open it with a head tilt chin lift or a modified jaw thrust. I think everyone's CPR, if you've ever taken CPR class, you know head, tilt, chin lift, look, listen, feel, right? If you think they've hurt their neck or have trauma to the head or neck, you suspect what we call a C-spine or cervical spine injury. And all cervical spine means is the first 7 vertebrae of the neck are called cervical spine. So when you hear C-spine, they're just talking about neck. Pretty much. It's a fancier way to say neck. What we're going to do is we're going to keep that head in line, and we're going to push down on the jaws and lift up. And then we're going to ask ourselves, after it's open, is it obstructed? Is it blocked, meaning they're choking, or it's full of vomit? So basically, if they're conscious, we're going to do the Heimlich maneuver. That's why we teach a CPR class. If they're unconscious, we're going to do CPR. We're going to do chest compressions. Try to dislodge that object. And then if they have vomit or secretions, we're going to roll them over and put them what's in the recovery position, which is taught in every first aid class. And what that does is it allows the vomit to drain out, and it doesn't go back and inhale the vomit and what we call aspiration pneumonia, which is how a lot of people die from overdoses, and it's not pretty. Core skill number 4 is cardiopulmonary resuscitation. And I don't mean just CPR, I mean cardiopulmonary. So when we say cardio, we mean the heart, and pulmonary is obviously the lungs. So we need to resuscitate someone, because if they stop breathing, they're going to go into cardiac arrest. And if they're in cardiac arrest, we've got 4 minutes to initiate CPR, or they will have drain damage. And if we don't get it reversed, so CPR started within 6 minutes, they start to have irreversible brain damage, or drain damage, as I usually say it. And if it's after 10 minutes, it's irreversible death. When I worked the cardiac arrest at the scout camp last year, it was 45 minutes till EMS arrived, 30 minutes till first responders arrived. So we had AED CPR, but that just shows you how important this first aid can be at times. If no one had done it and they'd wait till EMS, we didn't have a great outcome, but there would have been no outcome whatsoever. First thing we're going to do is look at respiration and ventilation. Are they breathing? If they're not breathing, we're going to do rescue breaths, which is we're going to give them a breath every 10 breaths a minute. And the easy way to remember that is 2 breaths, 2 seconds, breathe in, 4 seconds, let them breathe out. This is hard to do when you have adrenaline. They've done peer-reviewed journals where in the ER where the average number of times they were given breaths a minute was 37. Everyone remembers to inhale, but they also have to exhale, get that CO2 off. That's equally important. So we teach my students in for 2, out for 4, and start again. It's a child, they're littler, so they breathe faster. So we do 20 breaths, which is 1 second in, 2 seconds out. And all we have to do is when we do that with that pocket mask is make sure they have adequate chest rise and fall. That's all we have to do. In addition to respiration, that's the pulmonary part. Then we have to make sure the cardio part's okay. So we need to know if they have a pulse. So we first check it. We can check it in the wrist. If it doesn't work, we check it in the neck and the carotid artery. I usually do both at the same time just to save me a step. If not, we're going to start chest compressions. And we're going to do followed by 30 compressions followed by 2 breaths. So this is your basic CPR class. But we have to have this initiated within the first 4 minutes if this guy is going to have a chance to survive. And then if you have an AED, put it on as soon as possible. There's the number one thing that saves people's lives in cardiac arrest is early defibrillation. That's why there's AEDs everywhere. In fact, at my church, we started with 1. Now we got 1 on every floor because we try to get it done within the first 2 minutes. That's the best. But 4 minutes, you start having damage. When I was a paramedic, and they would give me 2 minutes to respond from the time we were toned out. Think about that, because we might have to get dressed or we might have to do whatever, it might be in the middle of, eating a piece of steak or whatever we're doing. We get 2 minutes to get on that truck and get out. And then if it takes 6, 7 minutes to get to your house, we're already at 9 minutes.
That emphasizes the need for us to know some basic skills so that we can do what we can do until professional help gets there.
Yep. And like I said, in the rural, it's worse. In the rural, sometimes if they're in an unmanned station, they have 5 minutes to respond because they have to drive to the station to get the truck.
So my mother had a massive stroke, and it took the sheriff was there really quickly, but it was, I don't know, a good half hour or so before we had help come. And that's a long time.
Yeah, the rural area volunteers are hard to get, and paramedics are even harder to get. So paramedics are a nationwide shortage. So this is where these volunteer squads and these volunteer firefighters and these first aiders, as I call them on the East Coast, they have just first aid emergency responders. That's where these guys are really critical to provide this stopgap till the ambulance can get there. When you think about a city, like I live in St. Louis, we have more ambulances, and we're blessed. I wouldn't say that we know what to do with. They're always busy and running. All the firefighters here are also paramedics. So it's a lot different in the rural than the city. So the further out you are, the more important first aid is. Core skill number 5, treat for shock. Sounds scary, but the first aid level, it's super easy. First thing we're going to say is are they in an environment too hot or too cold? If they are, get them out of it. I have worked with patients that have gotten overheated playing softball in August and 104 degrees and are seasoning right at home plate. Do you think I started care for them on the home plate? No. Get in my air-conditioned truck. Likewise, when I was in Minnesota, we'd have guys pass out from ice fishing and drinking all day long. We have to go out and get them in their Carhartts. Do you think we started working on them in 40 below weather? No. Get them in my warm truck. So the first thing we want to do is get them out of that environment, because they're not going to get any better if that's the problem, right? We got to get them out of that. Right. In most cases, if we think the patient's in shock, how do we know that? Well, if they're pale, cool, and clammy, they're probably going into shock. If they're major bleeding, probably going into shock. In any event, it's real simple. Cover them with a blanket. Every first aid kit now should have one of those little emergency Mylar blankets in it. We talked about that in first aid. Reflects 90% of heat. Cover them up. For too cold or I'm going into shock, it's real simple. Cover them with that blanket. Those things are like $3 or $4, maybe a little more now since the last 4 years, but they're really cheap. Every time I go to Bass Pro Shops, I see one, I grab one, throw it in. They're real easy to carry. Put that in your first aid kit. I think I have 4 or 5 in my first aid kit alone. They now have ones that are like big hand warmers, but bigger, that cover the whole chest or the body. So now they make bigger ones. If they're hypothermic, been on the cold all day, cover them with a blanket. If they're too hot, well, obviously we're not going to cover them with a blanket. We need to loosen the clothing. We can do our passive cooling. We can use a cool moderate mist if we have a little spray bottle, or we can put ice packs to the torso. I carry 4 ice packs in my big bag. So I can put them wherever I need to put them, and I can use those to help cool off the patient. Now they're even talking about full water baths, but most of us can't create a full water bath in the field. You know what I mean? Bandaging, skill number 6. We have to know how to bandage someone. Not only do we know how to bandage someone for major bleeding, but most of the time in first aid, it's not going to, thank goodness, it's not going to be life-threatening. I'm going to get, we're going to have kids with cuts and scrapes and boo-boos, as we call them. So anyway, bandaging is a core skill. So way at the end, after we've done our life threats, when it's time to examine them for the specific disability, my boo-boo or whatever, we're going to clean, dress, and bandage minor wounds. And there are so many things you can use, but just to clear up the definition, a dressing is something we put on a wound, and a bandage is something we use to secure the wound. So we're going to clean the wound with an antiseptic wipe or soap and water, whatever we have available. We're going to dress the wound, usually with a gauze plaid. There's also these new hydrogel pads that are really fancy. And then we're going to secure with a suitable bandage. It can be just a gauze roll. It can be ace wrap. It can be a cravat. Or we can just have a Band-Aid. The Band-Aid has the bandage and the dressing combined. You just stick it on there. It could be tape. But this is basically a core skill we need to do, because we don't want to have infection. We don't want the wounds that are not life-threatening to become a problem, especially if you're out of camp all week. I also add Neosporin. Some people like it. Some people don't. Do what works for you. But I've had little cuts on my fingers camping that I didn't take care of right away, and they got infected, and they really hurt for several days. Unnecessarily, because I just didn't take the time to clean it, put some Neosporin in a Band-Aid. When I do that, I don't have problems. There are some special things you have to think about, special types of bandaging, splinting things you have to think about, like thermal burns. We have to cool the wound first. If we have something caustic like acid or powder or something, we need to remove it. We need to remove that substance with a lot of water. If it's a solid powder, we need to brush it off first, because the water will activate it. Like a lot of acids are inert till you put them in water. They have to be aqueous, as we said in chemistry. And then we're going to apply our dressings. If we have eyes, the big thing to remember about eyes is don't pull anything out of them. And we want to bandage both eyes, because one eye will follow where the other one goes. And we don't want, especially if there's something in the eye, to scratch up the eye. So we cover both eyes. If we have abdominal organs sticking out, it's a bad day for them. But we cover that with a moist dressing. And under no circumstances do we push that back into the body. Leave it alone. That's what surgeons drive Maseratis, and I drive a pickup. Impaled objects, we don't want to pull them out either, because they may do more damage cutting on the way out than they did on the way in. So we stabilize those with bulky dressings, and we let, the surgeons who drive the Maseratis take those out, or they can hemus clamp them right there and have blood should they need it, and all that good stuff. We don't do that in the field. You can pull it out if it's in the cheek or if it impedes CPR. Now, in 29 years, I've never seen one that impedes CPR and they're still living. So we usually don't even start CPR, because if it impedes CPR, it means it's in the heart and they did. The last core skill is splinting. When we do splinting, this again is at the end after we're sure that all the life threats are done. We're not going to waste. I don't want you guys spending all the time trying to splint an ankle and forget that he's dead, not breathing. By the time you get that splint done, he's going to be dead because you didn't breathe for him. So again, priority. That's why we put these in an order. If we think something's fractured or dislocated, we want to use a rigid splint, and by far the best ones are SAM splints. Just remember, if it's a joint, we want to splint the bone above and below. If it's a bone, we want to splint the joint above and below. I carry in my splinting module like 5x9s or 6 because I pad the open areas. If you don't have a SAM splint, you can improvise. This summer at camp, I think I showed you, we had a kid have an open distal tibia fracture, and I splinted it with a pool noodle because the lifeguards couldn't find their first aid bag wherever it was. We were out in this place where they had like a water gym or whatever. If we do pad it, we want to make sure we didn't put it on too tight. So we make sure we have a pulse before and after, and it can move and it's not going numb. This is why we take the first aid class. This is why it takes 1 to 2 days. It takes time to teach these things and get some practice. If it's a sprain or a strain, then we're going to use an elastic bandage. So ACE wrap. We want to remember our little RICE mnemonic: rest, ice, compression, and elevation. By ice, we mean 20 minutes every 2 to 3 hours, and don't put ice direct on it. Put something between it, like a piece of cloth or something. That's not, we leave it on the wound for 6 hours till it becomes frostbite and dies, right? You just do it off and on. Again, we want to make sure we didn't put it on too tight, so we check our circulation and movement, make sure it's not turning purple and numb after we do that. Let's put it all together. These core skills, 5 of them are critical. 6 if you count bandaging with the bleeding control. And 1 is really good to prevent injuries becoming worse, because with bones, if they break and they're allowed to move around, they're basically a shank and they can cut arteries. That's why we want to immobilize the bone. We don't want it to cut muscle. We don't want it to cut nerves. We don't want it to cut arteries. That's why we hold it still and we splint it. So we keep it safe till they can get, the cast on or get the surgeon to wire it back together or whatever they do. Here's our 7 core skills: patient assessment, control bleeding, maintain a patent airway, CPR, treat for shock, bandaging, splinting. These are the 7 core skills. Everything else after that is lagniappe, as they say in Louisiana. Now let's put the skills with the assessment. We're going to assess the scene. We're going to determine if they're conscious or not. We're going to control all major bleeding. We're going to open the airway. We're going to perform rescue breathing if they're not breathing. We're going to perform CPR and put on an AED if they have no pulse. We're going to keep the shock patient thermoregulated at the right temperature. We're going to bandage and splint as needed. And then if they're unresponsive, we'll put them in the recovery position. If they're breathing and they're having trouble. That is it. Sounds like a lot, but it happens really, really fast.
Yeah, it does. And this has been a good reminder for me, because I used to take every year they'd give us first aid training. So I kind of had it drilled in. And then since I've retired from that, it hasn't been quite as frequent. And so this is a good reminder to me that, I don't have to be EMT level or paramedic level, but I need to know these basic skills and I need to know the order to go in so that we take care of priorities first. So thank you.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's the next thing I was going to say. Make sure you get reputable training. So I got 4 guys here that all do CPR: American Heart Association, the ECSI. I'm an instructor for both of those. The Health Safety Institute, the older ASHI, now it's called HSI, the American Red Cross, all do reputable training. So you got to be careful who you train with, because YouTube has some interesting folks on it, and they'll say some interesting things because they took a first aid class.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. We have to have good information, and unfortunately, we've seen that there's some really bad information out there on the web. So
I've even seen from guys who have companies that sell first aid kits, and they'll have these claims like where'd you come up with that? Also, keep current. So most certifications are 2 years before you have to recertify, but if you don't do this every day, I would say do it annually, just because you need to practice. And then, of course, like you said, Jonathan, practice often. I make my poor kid, I drive him nuts. He'll be sitting there minding his own business, playing his Nintendo, and I'll be like, put a pressure bandage on me. And I do it because that's what's going to happen in real life. He's going to be all in the zone, and then it's going to happen. I mean, I also
Good
make him
point.
go out and light me a fire in the fire pit with a flint steel too, just for giggles at 10 o'clock at night when he wants to stay up past his bedtime. I'm a bad dad, but you have to do practice, and you have to do it often. I make him practice. Where is the fire extinguisher? We almost had to use one once. Where is it? How do you get it off? My son, I told him to go get the fire extinguisher because we had an issue. He knew where it was, but he didn't know about the little flippy metal thing you have to flip. So he finally figured it out. But those are the things, like under stress, when that adrenaline kicks, you don't think about, when you lose all that fine motor skill and you haven't practiced, they say you sink to the lowest level of your training. That's very true. You do. So practice, practice, practice. It doesn't take a lot, a couple times a week, you're just sitting there, put a pressure bandage on your wife or dog or cat, or practice a splint here and there. It doesn't require a life commitment. If you know how to do that, it's not scary. If you've not practiced it and you've never done it, it's very scary.
Right. That muscle memory is pretty critical.
Sure is. Now, I'm not trying to make you all become paramedics. Believe me, I wouldn't wish that on anyone. But unless you really want to do it.
But these skills are so critical. And yeah, we don't have to go to that level, but some basic training. And I like the idea of kind of spur the moment, do it, because it's one thing when you can sit and think about it and say, oh, yeah, I've got to do this and this. It's another thing when it hits you cold and you've got to make quick decisions.
It sure does. You can see the difference. And when I teach paramedics, I just drill it before we send them to clinicals. So, and it does make a huge difference in how well they do. So that's all I have. Any other questions or anything, send them to me. I usually try to answer them for your people, and they email all the good questions. And that's all I got. That's first aid core skills in a nutshell.
Our audience does have a lot of great questions and experiences. And for our audience today, the question of the day: what questions do you have for Nick? Or what experiences have you had where you had to do first aid, and what are you doing differently because of that? Comment below. And thanks. And thanks to Nick for being here and for being part of the solution.
Absolutely.